The wind over the ocean had a mournful quality that night, whispering like the ghost of a forgotten storm. High tide crashed against the rocks of Hollow Point, spraying the docks with cold salt water. The Serena, a small fishing vessel, was due back hours ago, and as midnight approached, its absence weighed heavily on the few men still lingering by the docks. Ben Harker stood at the edge of the pier, peering into the blackness of the sea, his weathered hands gripping the railing. His brother Sam was on that boat. They'd sailed out early in the morning, hoping for a good catch. But by evening, a heavy fog rolled in, smothering the horizon like a shroud. No one had seen them since. "You sure they were heading back before dark?" asked the harbor master, a stout man named Eustace. His voice was low, cautious, like he already knew the answer. Ben nodded grimly, eyes narrowing as he scanned the inky water again. "Sam said they'd be in by sundown." Eustace shifted uneasily, glancing out to the waves as though expecting the boat to materialize from the mist at any moment. Might have got turned around in the fog. Happens this time of year. But Ben wasn't convinced. The sea had a way of claiming things, and tonight it felt more alive than usual. The rhythmic crash of waves almost too steady, too deliberate. He heard stories as a child, tales the old fishermen used to tell. Stories about strange things beneath the waves, about boats vanishing without a trace, about the water coming alive in ways it shouldn't. Sam used to laugh them off, but Ben always listened. A soft splash drew his attention. At first he thought it was just another wave slapping the dock, but then there it was again. A soft, irregular sound, like something was moving just beneath the surface. "Eustace," Ben whispered, motioning the man over. "You hear that?" They both stood in silence for a moment, listening. The splash came again, and this time it was followed by something else, an eerie scraping sound as though something hard was dragging along the bottom of the dock. Before either man could speak, a low rumble echoed from the water. The sound seemed to come from the depths, resonating through the wood beneath their feet. Eustace stumbled back, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" Ben took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The surface of the water rippled, and for a brief moment he thought he saw something. A dark shape moving beneath the waves, large and serpentine. But before he could make out any details, it was gone, sinking back into the depths as the waves calmed. "Must be the tide," Eustace muttered, though the quiver in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. He took a step away from the edge of the pier. "We should head back, Ben. Nothing more we can do tonight." But Ben couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The Serena wasn't just delayed. It was gone. And whatever was in the water had something to do with it. As they turned to leave, the silence was broken by a distant cry, a long, drawn-out wail that seemed to carry across the water. It was faint, but unmistakable, a sound so full of terror it made the hair on the back of Ben's neck stand on end. Eustace froze. Was that a person? Ben's blood ran cold. It didn't sound human. Without a word, both men broke into a run, rushing back toward the shore. Behind them, the sea swelled, a towering wave rising from the depths, unseen in the darkness, but heard as it crashed against the rocks. And as the water pulled back, something glistened on the shore, catching the faint glow of the moon. It was a piece of wood, splintered and slick with seaweed. Ben recognized the name painted on the side, now barely legible beneath the muck. It was part of the Serena. And it wasn't alone. Half buried in the sand beside it was something that had once been a man's hand, still clutching a frayed length of fishing net. The sea had taken them, or something in it had. By dawn, the news had spread through the coastal town like wildfire. The Serena was gone, its wreckage scattered along the shoreline, and its crew, Ben's brother Sam among them, was missing. The hand found by the dock had been identified as belonging to Jonas Wilkes, the youngest deckhand, barely 17. The townspeople gathered in hushed clusters near the docks, their faces pale and drawn, speaking in low murmurs as the tides brought more fragments of the doomed vessel ashore. Ben stood by the harbor, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The sea looked deceptively calm now, the fog from the previous night burned away by the rising sun. But it felt wrong. There was a weight to the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. Something had shifted, and every instinct screamed at him to stay away from the water. Yet here he stood, watching, waiting, hoping for any sign of Sam. "Ben!" A voice called softly behind him. He turned to see Molly, Sam's wife, her face streaked with tears. She was holding their infant daughter, clutching the child as though the act itself could protect her from the nightmare that had begun to unfold. "Any news?" she asked, her voice trembling with the thin thread of hope she still clung to. He shook his head. "No, nothing yet. We sent word to the Coast Guard, but they won't be here until later. The storm last night hit the surrounding towns pretty hard. We're on our own for now." Molly's eyes flickered toward the ocean, her lips quivering. He's still out there, Ben. I know it. Sam wouldn't leave us. Not like this." Ben swallowed hard, wanting to comfort her, but he couldn't shake the image of the hand they'd found, fingers stiff and cold as stone. "We'll find him," he promised, though the words tasted hollow in his mouth. As Molly walked back toward the town square, the mayor arrived, his face a mask of forced calm. Nathaniel Croft had been mayor of Hollow Point for almost 2 decades, a man who prided himself on keeping the town orderly and prosperous. But today there was no hiding the fear behind his eyes. "Ben," Croft said, pulling him aside, "I need to speak with you." Ben followed him to the edge of the dock, where the mayor's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "This can't get out of control. We've got the summer festival coming up in a few days. Tourists are already arriving. We can't afford to scare them off." Ben frowned. "You think that's what matters right now? My brother's gone, and Jonas..." His voice caught in his throat. "We found his hand, Nathaniel. His hand. This is bigger than some festival." Croft's expression hardened. "I understand the gravity of the situation, Ben, but we need to stay calm. There have been accidents before. Storms, rogue waves. The sea is dangerous." "This wasn't just a storm," Ben interrupted, his voice low but urgent. "There's something in the water. I don't know what it is, but it's not natural. Eustace heard it too. Something was out there last night. Something dragged the Serena under." Croft stared at him for a long moment, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Look, I don't want to hear any more of this talk about creatures or ghosts from the sea. We keep this quiet, understand? If word gets out, panic will follow. We'll conduct a search, bring in more boats if we have to, but we keep it under control." Ben's jaw clenched, anger and disbelief bubbling beneath the surface, but he knew better than to argue. The mayor's word was law in Hollow Point, and for now, that meant keeping their mouths shut about the strange happenings in the water. As they spoke, a commotion broke out near the shoreline. A group of fishermen had gathered around something, shouting and gesturing toward the sea. Ben hurried over, pushing through the small crowd, and his stomach twisted at what he saw. Lying in the shallow surf was the body of a man, half covered in seaweed and sand, his eyes wide and frozen in a mask of terror. His clothes were torn, and his skin was pale, waterlogged. It was Sam. Ben fell to his knees, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he reached for his brother, something strange caught his eye. Around Sam's wrists and ankles were deep, jagged marks like something had wrapped around him, pulling him down into the depths. The sea had taken him, but it hadn't let go easily. And as the tide receded, a strange, guttural sound echoed from the ocean, a distant, haunting moan that seemed to carry a warning. Whatever had dragged Sam under wasn't done with Hollow Point. It was only just beginning. The storm arrived that evening, rolling in with a fury that turned the sky into a churning mass of black clouds. Rain lashed against the windows of the small homes lining the coast, and the wind howled through the narrow streets of Hollow Point, bending trees and sending loose debris tumbling down the roads. The townspeople, already shaken by the grim discovery of Sam's body, now found themselves trapped in their homes, with the raging sea at their doorstep. Ben sat by the window of his small cottage, staring out at the storm. The rhythmic pounding of rain against the glass was broken only by the occasional distant crash of waves against the cliffs. His mind replayed the events of the last few days over and over again. Sam's body, the strange marks on his wrists, and the eerie sounds that had echoed from the ocean. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The sea wasn't just angry. It was alive, and it wanted more. A loud knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Ben crossed the room, opening the door just enough to see Eustace standing on the porch, his raincoat soaked through, and his eyes wide with fear. "Ben, you gotta come quick!" Eustace shouted over the wind, his voice frantic. "It's Will Tanner. He's seen something out in the water. Says it's got eyes, Ben. Glowing eyes. Right in the middle of the storm." Ben's heart raced as he grabbed his coat and followed Eustace into the storm, the rain instantly drenching him as they fought their way down the slippery path toward the docks. A few other fishermen had gathered near the pier, their faces drawn and pale. Will Tanner, a burly man with a reputation for drinking a bit too much, stood at the edge of the dock, staring out into the storm-tossed sea. "I saw it," Will muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Right there, just beyond the breakers. Something big, moving under the water. And those eyes, glowing, like fire. Just watching, like it was waiting for something." Ben squinted into the darkness, but all he could see was the white-capped waves crashing against the rocks. "You're sure it wasn't just lightning reflecting off the water?" he asked, though he knew it was a weak attempt to explain away the fear gnawing at him. Will shook his head violently. "No, it wasn't lightning. It was alive. It's been out there for days now, I reckon. Maybe longer. I don't know what it is, but I've fished these waters my whole life and I've never seen anything like it." Before Ben could respond, another massive wave slammed against the dock, sending a spray of seawater over them. But this time, the wave seemed different. It wasn't just the force of the storm. There was something beneath the surface, something vast, shifting and churning just out of sight. For a split second, Ben thought he caught a glimpse of it, a shadow moving beneath the water, too large to be a fish, too fast to be a whale. And then he saw them. Two glowing orbs, faint at first but growing brighter as they swayed just beneath the waves. They were eyes, large, unblinking, and filled with a cold, malevolent intelligence. The men on the dock gasped, some taking an instinctive step back, while others cursed under their breath. The storm seemed to intensify in response, the wind howling louder, the rain hammering down with renewed fury. "Did you see that?" Will whispered, his voice trembling. Tell me you saw that. Ben's throat was dry, but he nodded. I saw it. Eustace, his face pale and slick with rain, spoke up, his voice barely audible. It's the same thing we heard the night the Serena disappeared. It's out there watching us. Whatever it is, it's not natural. The men stood in stunned silence as the storm raged around them, the eyes vanishing beneath the waves just as quickly as they had appeared. But the feeling remained, an oppressive, suffocating presence that seemed to hang in the air, pressing down on them like the weight of the ocean itself. We need to leave, Ben said suddenly, his voice tight. We need to warn the others. If that thing's out there, it's not going to stop with just watching. Eustace nodded, already turning back toward the town. We should tell the mayor. Get everyone inland until this storm blows over. As they hurried back up the hill toward the safety of the town, another sound reached their ears. A deep, guttural moan rising from the depths of the ocean, louder than before, and filled with a sense of ancient, unfathomable hunger. The storm had trapped them, and whatever lived beneath the sea was growing bolder. By the time they reached the town square, people were already beginning to emerge from their homes, drawn by the noise of the storm and the eerie sounds from the ocean. Fear was etched on every face, and as the wind howled through the narrow streets, it carried a message no one could ignore. The demon from the depths had come closer, and it wasn't going to leave empty-handed. The storm showed no sign of letting up as Ben and Eustace reached the town hall. Inside, a crowd had gathered, nervous voices rising in a low, anxious murmur. People clung to one another, eyes wide with the fear that had been building since Sam's body was found. Every creak of the old building under the force of the wind made them jump, as though the storm itself was a living thing, trying to claw its way inside. Mayor Croft stood at the front, speaking in hurried, clipped tones to a group of council members, his usual air of authority fraying at the edges. His eyes flicked up as Ben and Eustace burst in, their faces pale and waterlogged from the storm. You've seen it too, haven't you? Croft said, his voice low but sharp. What the hell is going on out there? Ben didn't waste time with formalities. It's real, Nathaniel. There's something in the water. We saw it. Its eyes glowing under the waves. And it's getting closer. The crowd quieted at Ben's words, the panic that had been simmering just below the surface now rising to a boil. Some gasped, while others muttered nervously, their imaginations conjuring up images of sea monsters from the old folk tales. I told you we need to get people out of here, Ben continued, stepping forward. That thing has already killed Sam and the others. It's not going to stop with them. Croft raised a hand, attempting to calm the rising tide of fear. We can't just abandon the town. The storm's blocked all the roads and the Coast Guard's still hours away. We need to keep people safe until help arrives. Safe? Eustace barked, his voice shaking. There's no safe, as long as that thing's out there. It's only a matter of time before it comes ashore. As the tension in the room mounted, a voice rang out from the back, clear and unwavering. There's something more to this. Something we've all forgotten. All eyes turned toward an elderly man standing by the doorway, a cane gripped in his weathered hand. It was Amos Blackwood, the town historian and local eccentric. Most people dismissed his ramblings about old legends and forgotten lore, but tonight, his words carried a weight that silenced the room. Amos, Croft said with a hint of skepticism. What are you talking about? Amos limped forward, his gaze sweeping across the gathered townspeople. I've been reading through the old records, the ones most of you haven't looked at in decades. This town, Hollow Point, has a history far darker than most of you realize. You think that thing out in the water is new? It's not. It's been here before. The room seemed to hold its breath as Amos continued. Back in the 1800s, there were reports of strange disappearances. Boats vanishing at sea, people dragged from their homes at night, always near the water. The stories got buried over time, passed off as superstition, but they all pointed to one thing: something ancient living beneath the waves. The old fishermen used to call it the demon of the deep. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ben's skin prickled as Amos went on, his voice growing quieter, almost reverent. There were whispers of a pact, a deal made between the town's founders and the creature. In exchange for protection, the town would offer sacrifices to keep it at bay. Livestock at first, then other things. Croft's face darkened. That's absurd, Amos. You expect us to believe some old wives' tale about a sea demon? This is just a freak storm, nothing more. But Ben was listening closely. What happened to the pact? Amos met Ben's gaze, his eyes haunted. It was broken. They stopped honoring it. They grew greedy, careless. The last recorded disappearance was in 1863. After that, it all went quiet. Until now. Ben's heart sank. You think it's come back? Amos nodded grimly. I think it's been waiting. And now it's come to collect what it's owed. The room erupted into chaos. Some shouted that it was nonsense, while others demanded to know why they hadn't been told about the town's dark history. But Ben felt a terrible certainty growing in his chest. Whatever the truth of the legend, the fact remained that the thing in the water was real, and it was coming for them. We need to stop it, Ben said, raising his voice above the din. If this thing is here because of something that happened in the past, we need to find a way to fix it. If there was a pact, there must be a way to undo it. Amos shook his head. There's no record of how to stop it. All we know is that it demands blood. Ben's stomach turned, but there was no time to dwell on the horror of it. Then we need to be ready. We can't just sit here waiting for it to take more lives. Croft looked torn, but before he could respond, a deafening crash sounded from the direction of the docks, followed by a deep, otherworldly moan that reverberated through the air. It had begun. The demon of the deep was no longer content to linger in the shadows. It was coming for them all. The crashing sound from the docks echoed through the town, sending a ripple of terror through the crowd. People surged toward the windows, peering out into the storm. But the dark sky and heavy rain made it impossible to see what had caused the noise. The only certainty was that it was close. Too close. We need to get to higher ground, someone shouted, panic rising in their voice. The suggestion stirred the room into chaos, with townspeople scrambling for the doors, desperate to escape the grip of whatever had risen from the sea. Ben stood frozen for a moment, listening. The low moan that followed the crash seemed to reverberate through the very ground beneath him, a sound so deep it rattled in his chest. It wasn't just the storm anymore. The thing they had feared, the demon from the deep, was here. Everyone calm down! Mayor Croft's voice cut through the panic as he moved to block the exit. We're not going to outrun this storm. There's no sense in running into the night when we don't even know what's out there. Ben glanced toward Amos, who was standing by the window, his cane trembling in his hand. The old man's face was pale, and his usual calm had given way to quiet dread. It's here, isn't it? Ben asked. Amos nodded slowly. It's come for the town. There's no escaping it now. Ben's mind raced. He knew Amos was right. The creature had been watching, waiting, and now it was making its move. Running would only scatter them, make them easy prey. They had to confront it, find a way to stop it. But how could they fight something so ancient, so unknowable? Another crash sounded from outside, closer this time. followed by the splintering of wood and the unmistakable groan of collapsing structures. It was as though the sea itself was tearing into the town, pulling it apart piece by piece. Ben's thoughts snapped back to his brother Sam's body, the marks around his wrists. This thing didn't just kill, it dragged its victims into the deep. "We have to face it," Ben said, stepping toward the mayor. "We can't run from this. If we don't stop it, it'll tear the whole town apart." Croft looked at him, desperation in his eyes. "And how exactly do you plan to stop it? You saw what happened to your brother. You saw those marks. We can't fight something like that." Amos cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "There may be a way," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The old stories. They spoke of a ritual. The townspeople believed they could appease the demon, make it go back to the depths, but it required a sacrifice, an offering." Ben's heart sank. "What kind of offering?" Amos hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "A life. They believed the creature would only accept a human life in exchange for sparing the town." A murmur of shock and horror rippled through the room. Croft looked as though he might collapse. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice shaking. "We're not sacrificing anyone, that's insane." Amos met his gaze, his eyes dark and steady. "I don't like it any more than you do, but the demon hasn't forgotten the old pact. It's come to collect, and if we don't give it what it wants, it will take what it's owed." Ben felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He wanted to deny it, to reject the idea of sacrificing an innocent person to some ancient creature. But the truth was right in front of them. If they did nothing, the entire town would be swallowed by the sea. Before he could respond, another moan rose from the depths, this time accompanied by the sound of splintering wood and the unmistakable crash of houses crumbling into the ocean. The demon was getting closer, and its hunger was growing. "We don't have much time," Amos said gravely. "It's only a matter of hours before the town is lost. We either find a way to appease the creature, or we all go down with it." Croft ran a hand through his hair, his face ashen. What are you suggesting, Amos? That we choose someone to die? Who makes that decision?" Amos didn't answer, but his silence was enough. The weight of the decision hung in the air, suffocating. Ben looked around at the terrified faces of the townspeople, knowing there was no easy answer. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, a deep rumble that felt like the very earth was groaning under the pressure of the storm. The walls of the town hall shuddered, and outside the wind howled with a fury that seemed almost alive. "We need to make a decision," Ben said, his voice thick with dread. "If we don't, there won't be anyone left to save." A crash rang out from behind them, louder than before. The demon had reached the edge of the town, its fury now unstoppable. They were running out of time. The town hall trembled as another monstrous wave slammed into the coast, sending sprays of salt water crashing over the walls outside. The storm had become a living force, fueled by the malevolent presence beneath the sea. The demon was close now. Too close. "We don't have much time," Ben said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. He turned to Amos. "If there's a chance to stop this thing, we need to know exactly what we're facing. Where does the ritual happen?" Amos took a deep breath, his face lined with worry. "There's an old cave along the cliffs just outside town. The stories say that's where the original pact was made, where the first offering was given. If the demon can be stopped, it'll be there." Ben nodded grimly. "Then that's where we'll go." Croft stepped forward, his face pale. "Wait a minute, Ben. You're not seriously thinking of going out there, are you? That thing, it'll tear you apart." Ben met the mayor's gaze, his jaw clenched. I'm not letting this town be destroyed. We need to face it, or it'll take every last one of us. A hush fell over the room as Ben spoke, the gravity of the moment sinking in. The townspeople were frozen, caught between terror and hope. But Ben didn't have time to wait for them to make up their minds. He grabbed a lantern from the wall and turned to Eustace, who had been silently watching from the corner. "Are you with me?" Eustace swallowed hard, then nodded. "I'm not letting you go out there alone." Molly, still clutching her infant daughter, stepped forward, her eyes filled with grief and determination. "If this is for Sam, then you do what you need to do, Ben. Just come back." Ben gave her a tight nod, his heart heavy with the weight of his brother's death. He wasn't sure if he would come back, but he knew what he had to do. The wind screamed as Ben and Eustace stepped out into the storm, the cold rain pelting their faces as they made their way down the muddy path toward the cliffs. The lantern flickered weakly in Ben's hand, its light barely cutting through the darkness. The waves crashed violently against the rocks below, and every few seconds they could hear the deep, guttural moan of the demon rising from the depths. "There it is!" Eustace shouted over the storm, pointing toward a jagged opening in the cliffside. The cave entrance loomed before them, dark and foreboding, its mouth wide enough to swallow them whole. As they approached, Ben felt the air grow colder, the storm's fury almost muted in the presence of the cave. There was something ancient and terrible about the place, as if the very rocks had been carved by the hands of some long-forgotten god. Inside, the cave was slick with moisture, the walls glistening with salt and strange, slimy growths. The sound of the sea echoed all around them, a constant haunting presence that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Further in, the air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the floor of the cave sloped downward, deeper into the earth. "I don't like this," Eustace muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Feels like we're walking right into its lair." Ben pressed on, ignoring the creeping dread that gnawed at his insides. He had no choice but to go forward. There was no turning back now. After what felt like hours, they reached the heart of the cave, a vast, open chamber lit only by the faint glow of the lantern. In the center of the room, a pool of black water shimmered, its surface unnaturally still. The air was thick with an oppressive, suffocating presence, as though the cave itself was alive. "This is it," Amos said, his voice low as he limped into the chamber behind them. "This is where the pact was made." Ben knelt beside the pool, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the inky blackness. For a moment, all was silent. Then, from the depths of the water, something stirred. A shape began to rise, slowly at first, then faster, until the surface rippled and parted. A massive form emerged, its dark, leathery skin glistening with seawater. The demon was enormous, its body serpentine and alien, with long, sinewy limbs that clawed at the edges of the pool. Its eyes, those glowing, malevolent orbs, fixed on Ben, filled with an ancient hunger. Eustace gasped, stumbling back in terror, but Ben stood his ground. "You've taken enough from us," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "It ends here." The demon let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to shake the walls of the cave. Its massive head lowered toward Ben, its eyes burning with fury. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, the creature's gaze locking with Ben's. And then, with a terrible screeching roar, it lunged. Ben dove to the side just as the demon's jaws snapped shut where he had stood. Eustace grabbed a broken piece of wood and swung it at the creature, but the demon batted him aside effortlessly, sending him crashing into the cave wall. Ben scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He could feel the presence of the creature closing in, its massive body moving with terrifying speed. He had no weapon, no way to fight it, except his eyes darted to the pool. The water. That was where it had come from, and where it belonged. With a surge of adrenaline, Ben grabbed the lantern and hurled it into the pool. The flame flickered, then burst into a brilliant flare as the oil spilled across the surface, igniting the water in a wave of fire. The demon shrieked, its body thrashing wildly as the flames licked at its skin. For the first time, Ben saw fear in those glowing eyes. It reared back, its massive form writhing as the flames consumed it, and with one final ear-splitting scream, it plunged back into the depths of the pool, vanishing beneath the water. Ben stood there, breathing hard, as the cave grew silent once more. The fire burned out quickly, leaving only the faint glow of the smoldering pool. The demon was gone. But for how long? Eustace groaned as he pushed himself up, clutching his side. Is it over? Ben didn't answer. He wasn't sure it ever would be. But for now, the demon had retreated, and the town, what was left of it, was safe. For now, the deep had returned to its slumber. But Ben knew deep down that the sea never forgot its debts.